She stood in the center of the room holding a single envelope, and every single person in that restaurant, all 212 of them, went completely silent. Not because of what my mother had just said, not because of the tears running down my face. They went silent because of the man standing in the doorway. He was wearing dress whites, 4 stars on his shoulder, and he was looking directly at me. Not at my mother, not at the crowd, at me. And the expression on his face, it wasn't pity. It was something else entirely, something I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. It was respect. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because before that moment, before that envelope, before that man walked through those doors, there was a phone call. And that phone call changed everything. My name is Claire Sutton. I am 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that the only thing standing between me and a normal, happy existence was my own weakness. That is what my mother told me, repeatedly, at the dinner table, in the school parking lot, at every birthday party and holiday gathering and family reunion she could find an audience for. She would lean close and speak quietly, as if she were sharing a secret, but loud enough that whoever was nearby could hear every single word. Claire is sensitive, she would say, with a little smile that never reached her eyes. She takes everything so personally. And everyone would nod, because my mother, Diane Sutton, was charming and beautiful, and the kind of woman who made people feel like they were in on something when she spoke to them. Nobody ever stopped to wonder what it felt like to be the thing she was speaking about. I grew up in a small town in Virginia, the kind of place where everybody knows your family name, and your family name means something. The Suttons had been in that county for 4 generations. My grandfather had served in Korea. My father had done 2 tours in Vietnam before a roadside explosion took most of his hearing and sent him home early. By the time I was born, my father was a quiet man who spent most of his time in the garage and rarely argued with anyone about anything, especially not my mother. She had filled the silence he left behind with her own voice, and over the years, that voice had become the only one that mattered in our house. My sister, Renee, was 3 years younger than me and had inherited everything my mother valued. She was tall, blonde, effortlessly social, the kind of girl who got invited to every party and remembered to send thank you notes. My mother loved Renee in the loud, performative way she did everything, telling anyone who would listen how proud she was, how special Renee was, how Renee was going to do great things. Renee was not unkind, not exactly, but she had grown up watching my mother treat me a certain way and had absorbed the lesson without ever questioning it. I was the difficult one, the serious one, the one who asked too many questions and didn't smile enough and was going to have a hard time in life if she didn't learn to be more like her sister. I joined the United States Navy when I was 18 years old. I did not tell my mother until the day before I left for basic training, partly because I knew what she would say, and partly because I had learned very early that the safest way to make a decision in our household was to make it so completely that it could not be unmade. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Well, I suppose that makes sense. You never could figure out what you actually wanted to do with yourself." My father looked at his hands. Renee looked at her phone. I looked at the front door and counted the hours. I want to pause here because if you are new to this channel, welcome. I am so glad you found the Quiet Colonel, and I need you to do something for me right now while this story is just getting started, because what I am about to tell you is the kind of thing that is going to make you want to share this with someone you know. So before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And if you already know someone who needs to hear this today, send it to them right now. Okay, let's keep going. Basic training was the first place in my life where nobody knew my mother's name. Nobody knew that I was the Sutton girl who was supposedly difficult and serious and unlikely to amount to much. I was just a recruit, same as everyone else. And for the first time, I understood what it felt like to be evaluated on what I could actually do, rather than on the stories someone else had written about me. I was not the fastest or the strongest, but I was disciplined and precise, and I did not quit. My drill instructors noticed. My fellow recruits noticed. I noticed, maybe most of all, because it was the first time in my memory that noticing something good about myself did not immediately feel like a lie. I advanced through the enlisted ranks steadily, then received a commission, then advanced again. I specialized in intelligence operations, specifically in a field that I will describe only in general terms, because much of what I did remains classified. What I can tell you is that I spent years doing work that very few people know exists, in places that do not appear on the official records of where I was deployed, solving problems that could not be acknowledged publicly because acknowledging them would have required explaining how we knew about them in the first place. I was good at it. I was, according to the people who evaluated me, exceptionally good at it. I received commendations I was not allowed to discuss. I received a promotion that was processed through channels my own family did not have clearance to know about. And through all of it, I came home for holidays when I could, and I sat at my mother's table, and I listened to her tell the assembled relatives about Renee's new house, Renee's new car, Renee's new boyfriend who was in finance and very handsome, and I ate my food and I did not say anything, because the alternative was to say something I could not say, about work I could not describe, in places I could not name. My mother interpreted my silence as confirmation of everything she had always believed about me. Claire is still in the military, she would say, in the same tone she might use to describe a chronic health problem. She seems fine, you know how she is, very private. It works for her, I suppose. And whoever she was talking to would nod politely, because what else do you do? And Renee would change the subject to something about the new restaurant downtown, and I would go back to my food. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this story because I need sympathy. I have not needed sympathy in a long time. I am telling you this story because I want you to understand exactly how things stood between my mother and me on the night she called to tell me about the money, so that you understand what came next, so that you understand why when that man walked through the door in dress whites, I did not cry. Not from sadness anyway. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was in my apartment in Virginia Beach, still in the process of decompressing from an assignment that had lasted 11 months and taken me through 4 countries, none of which I will name here. I had been home for 3 weeks. I had slept more in those 3 weeks than I had in the preceding 4 months combined. I was, by any reasonable measure, not ready to have a complicated conversation with anyone, but my mother did not ask if I was ready. She opened with Renee. She always opened with Renee. Your sister is planning the most beautiful wedding, Claire. The venue alone, it's a converted estate, just gorgeous. Marcus's family has been so generous. Marcus was the finance boyfriend, now apparently a fiancé. I had not been informed of the engagement. That's wonderful, I said. I'm really happy for her. There was a pause on the line that I recognized, the pause my mother used when she was deciding whether to be gracious or direct. She chose direct. We need to talk about the contribution, she said. I waited. Marcus's family is covering most of the costs, of course, but there are certain things that are traditionally the responsibility of the bride's family, and your father and I are not in a position. Well, you know the situation with your father's health and the medical bills, and we just cannot take on the kind of number we're looking at for the catering and the flowers and the photography. Renee deserves to have everything perfect. It's her wedding day. Another pause. We were thinking $200,000. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, $200,000. Not as a question exactly, more like I was just saying the number out loud to see if it changed at all when spoken. Renee deserves this, my mother said. And frankly, Claire, you've been in the military for 16 years, and you don't have a husband or children or a mortgage. What are you spending your money on? You owe this to your family. You owe it to your sister. I thought about the 11 months I had just spent. I thought about the specific nature of the work I had done, the specific cost of that work, not in dollars, but in the other currency that kind of work extracts from a person. I thought about the commendation that was sitting in a folder in a secured facility somewhere with my name on it, and a citation that would never be read publicly. And I thought about my mother, sitting in her house in Virginia, telling me I owed her $200,000 for my sister's catering bill. "I'll think about it," I said. "Claire," her voice went flat, the way it did when she was moving from persuasion to something else. "This is not something to think about. This is family. If you cannot show up for your family, then I don't know what to tell you. I really don't. Because at a certain point, we have to be honest about what kind of person you are and what your priorities are." She paused again. "I told Renee I would handle this. Don't make me explain to your sister on her engagement that her own sister couldn't be bothered." I told her I had heard her. I told her I would be in touch. I hung up the phone, and I sat in my apartment, and I looked out the window at the water for a long time. 3 days later, I received a follow-up text, then another, then a voice message from Renee herself, her tone carefully calibrated between warmth and accusation, telling me how much this wedding meant to her, and how much it would mean to have the whole family come together for it, and that she really hoped I would find a way to make this work because it just wasn't going to feel complete without my support. The word support in my family had always been a financial term. I did not respond immediately. I had things to deal with. I had a debriefing process that was still ongoing, a medical evaluation that had flagged something requiring follow-up, and a meeting with my commanding officer about what came next in terms of my assignment. What came next, as it turned out, was something that I had been recommended for by 3 separate senior officers without my knowledge, and which my commanding officer described as the kind of thing that happened once in a career if you were lucky, and that most people spent an entire career not being considered for. I will tell you more about that in a moment. In the meantime, the texts for my mother continued. By the end of the first week, there were 11 of them. By the end of the second week, there were 19. They escalated in tone, from reminders to requests to what I can only describe as ultimatums. "We need an answer by Friday." Then, "Claire, this is unacceptable." Then, "I have spoken with your aunt and she agrees that your behavior is selfish and hurtful." Then, the one that landed differently than the others, the one I read twice and then set my phone face down on the counter. "If you cannot commit to this family when it matters, then you are not the daughter I raised, and I will not pretend otherwise. You will not be welcome at the wedding. You will not be welcome in this home. I have one daughter who loves her family. The other one can live with her choices." I put my phone down. I picked up a different phone, the kind that is not a smartphone, the kind that does not connect to commercial networks, and I made a call that I had been authorized to make once the relevant paperwork had been finalized. The person on the other end answered on the second ring. I confirmed that I accepted. I listened to the instructions. I hung up. 2 weeks after that, I drove to my mother's house for the first time in 8 months because Renee's engagement party was being held there, and I had decided that if there was going to be a conversation, it was going to happen in person, and it was going to happen on my terms. My mother met me at the door. She looked me up and down in the way she had always looked me up and down, cataloging everything she found insufficient. I was wearing civilian clothes, slacks, a simple blouse, because I rarely wore my uniform socially, and she had always told me that wearing it off-duty was showing off. She did not hug me. She said, "You came," in the tone of someone noting an unexpected weather event. Then she turned and walked back inside, and I followed her. The house was already full. Renee and Marcus were holding court in the living room, surrounded by his family and a collection of their combined friends, all of whom seemed very comfortable with each other in the way that people are when they have all attended similar schools and vacationed in similar places. Renee spotted me from across the room and came over with her arms extended, and her hug was genuine enough, whatever else she was feeling. "I'm so glad you're here," she said quietly, close to my ear. "Please, Claire, can we just have a good night?" I told her yes. I meant it. For the first 2 hours, it was fine. I spoke to relatives I hadn't seen in years, ate the food that had been catered in, made conversation with Marcus's parents, who were polite in the way that very wealthy people are polite when they are uncertain of where you fit in the social landscape. I did not mention my work. I did not mention the texts. I kept my face pleasant and my voice even, and I stood at the edge of the room and I watched my mother work the party like the expert she was, gliding from group to group, accepting compliments about the house and the decorations, and what a beautiful couple Renee and Marcus made. And then, around the 2-hour mark, she found her moment. She was standing near the center of the room with a cluster of women I recognized from the local charity circuit, women who had known our family for decades, who had watched me grow up, who had absorbed my mother's narrative about me so thoroughly that I sometimes wondered if they could have articulated any other version of who I was. My mother raised her voice just slightly, just enough to carry across the nearby conversations without appearing to perform. "The thing about Claire," she said with a little smile, "is that she has always put herself first, ever since she was young. Some children are natural givers and some children are, well, you know. Claire joined the military and we are proud of her service, of course, but she has never been the type to show up when the family needs her." She tilted her head in my direction without quite looking at me. $200,000 for her sister's wedding, and she cannot find it in herself. A murmur went around the group. One of the women looked at me with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and satisfied. I set down my glass. I looked at my mother. She met my eyes for the first time that evening, and in hers I saw the challenge she had always issued, the one she had been issuing my entire life. Say something, make a scene, prove that you are what I have always said you are. I did not say anything. Not yet. What I did instead was look at my watch, and then I looked at the door, because I had made a phone call 6 days earlier that I had not told anyone about, and I had been told to expect company at approximately 8:15, and it was 8:13. The doorbell rang at 8:14. My mother frowned slightly. "I'm not expecting anyone." She turned to a woman near her and said, "Excuse me a moment," and moved toward the front of the room. One of Renee's friends, a girl named Ashley, who had appointed herself unofficial door handler for the evening, got there first and opened it. The man standing on the front porch was in dress whites, full dress, the kind you wear to very specific, very formal occasions. He was approximately 60 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades not needing to remind himself to stand up straight. On his shoulder were 4 stars. In his hand was a slim black folder. Ashley said, and then didn't say anything else. The man stepped inside. He looked around the room with the calm, unhurried survey of someone who was very accustomed to walking into rooms and having those rooms orient themselves around him. Then his eyes found me, and he walked directly across the floor without speaking to anyone, without acknowledging anyone, until he was standing in front of me. "Commander Sutton," he said. The room was very quiet. I said, "Admiral." He held out his hand and I shook it, and he said, "I apologize for the intrusion on your personal time. I wanted to deliver this in person." He held out the black folder. I took it. "The secretary's office processed this morning. It's been a long time coming." He looked at me steadily. "Congratulations, you've earned it." I opened the folder. Inside was a single document on official letterhead. I read it. I already knew what it said, but I read it again because it seemed like the right thing to do. My mother was standing approximately 4 feet away. She had not moved since the man had walked through the door. I looked up at her and I saw something on her face that I had never seen there before in 34 years. I saw uncertainty, real uncertainty, the kind that does not know yet how to become something else. "Mom," I said, "this is Admiral Raymond Carver. He was my commanding officer for 6 of my last 8 years of service." I paused. "Admiral Carver, this is my mother, Diane Sutton." I held up the folder. "He just delivered my promotion orders." The Admiral nodded at my mother with the measured courtesy of a man who was very good at saying everything he needed to say without opening his mouth. "Promotion to what?" my mother said. Her voice was not entirely steady. I told her. I will not reproduce here what happened in the next 60 seconds, because some of it is private and some of it involves people who did not ask to be part of a story. What I will tell you is that the room did not go back to what it was before. Rooms rarely do. But I want to back up because I have been holding something back, something that is important to understanding why Admiral Carver was there, in person, why he had driven 2 hours to my mother's house in Virginia to hand me a folder that could have been sent through official channels. I want to tell you about the specific nature of what I had been doing for the previous 16 years, because without it, what happened at the party is just a surprising moment. With it, it is something else. I had spent the better part of a decade working in a unit that does not have a public name. What I did, in broad terms, was analysis and coordination for operations that existed at the intersection of intelligence work and direct action. I was not a combat operator, but the operators I worked with could not do what they did without what I contributed, and the people who ran those operations knew it, and over time, my name had become attached to a series of outcomes that were significant enough that a certain number of very serious people in very secure buildings had opinions about what happened to me next. The assignment I accepted on the phone that evening in my apartment, the one I mentioned earlier, was a joint position created specifically because 3 separate agencies had made a joint argument that a specific problem required a specific kind of person to address it, and that I was that person. It was the kind of position that carried with it a promotion that had been in discussion for over a year, the promotion that was now in the folder in my hand. My mother had spent 16 years telling people I was in the military and that she was proud of my service. She had never asked what I did. She had never asked because she had already decided that whatever it was not particularly important. Because if it were important, I surely would have mentioned it. And since I had not mentioned it, it was clearly not worth mentioning. This is the logic of people who have never considered the possibility that what they don't know might be the most significant thing in the room. She was considering it now. I want to stay with that moment a little longer, because I have carried it with me and I think it deserves more than a single paragraph. The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when everyone present simultaneously realizes they have been operating on a set of assumptions that were wrong. I have been in situations that required that realization to happen, and I know what it looks and sounds like. People stopped mid-sentence. Conversations that had been background noise simply ceased. Renee was standing near the stairs with her hand over her mouth. Marcus was next to her, and he was looking at me with an expression that I recognized from my work, the expression of someone rapidly recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a situation. My mother said, "I didn't, you never said," and then she stopped. Admiral Carver looked at her with an expression that I had seen him use in meetings when a subordinate said something that revealed a significant gap in their understanding, an expression of quiet patience that communicated without cruelty that the gap was substantial. He said, "Your daughter has spent the last 16 years doing work that most people in this country will never know about and will never be able to thank her for, because the nature of that work requires it to remain invisible. The fact that it is invisible is not a reflection of its importance." He paused. "It is a reflection of its importance." My mother looked at the folder in my hand. She looked at his shoulder. She looked at my face. And then she said in a voice that was almost inaudible, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I had thought about this question. I had thought about how I would answer it if it ever came, whether directly from her or from inside my own head. I had prepared several versions of the answer, some of which were gentle and some of which were not. Standing there in her living room with 212 people watching, I chose the gentle one. "Because you never asked," I said. "You never asked what I did, Mom, not once in 16 years." She opened her mouth. She closed it. The woman who had never been short of words her entire life had run out of them. There is something I need to tell you about what happened next, something that I did not expect and that changed the shape of the evening in a way I had not planned for. Marcus's father, a man named Gerald, who had been polite and somewhat distant all evening, walked across the room. He walked past my mother, past Renee, past everyone, until he was standing in front of me. He extended his hand. "I served," he said. "Navy, 1987 to 1994. I shook his hand. "Thank you," he said. "Whatever it is you did, thank you." And he walked back to where he had been standing without another word. That was when I heard it, very quiet at first, then less so. Two of the older men in the back of the room started clapping, then three more. It moved across the room in the way that things do when people recognize something real, something they didn't expect and couldn't have manufactured. By the time it reached the front of the room, it included almost everyone present. My mother did not clap. She stood very still in the center of the room, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before and have thought about many times since. It was not exactly remorse. It was closer to something I would describe as the specific feeling of having been wrong for a very long time about something that mattered, and knowing it, and not yet knowing what to do with that knowledge. The Admiral excused himself politely. He had other obligations that evening. He shook my hand again, nodded to the room, and left. Ashley closed the door behind him. The party resumed after a fashion. Conversations restarted, food was eaten, the music that someone had been playing softly in the background came back up a little bit, but the shape of the room had changed, and everyone in it felt it. I found a quiet spot near the kitchen doorway and stood there for a few minutes, just breathing. Renee found me there. She stood next to me without saying anything for a moment, and then she said, "I didn't know." Her voice was quiet. I told her I knew. She said, "Why didn't you ever?" And I said, "Because you would have told Mom." And she didn't argue with that, because it was true and she knew it. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I don't need $200,000, Claire. That's not, I want you at my wedding. That's what I want." I looked at her. She looked back at me. I believe she meant it. "I know," I said. "I'll be there." She hugged me, and this time the hug was different from the one at the door. It was the kind of hug you give someone when you are apologizing for something you do not have words for yet, when the words are still forming somewhere underneath everything else. I let her hold on for as long as she needed. My mother did not come to find me that evening. She circled the edges of the room for the rest of the party, and I saw her watching me from a distance several times, but she did not cross the floor. Just before I left, she appeared at my elbow while I was putting on my coat, close enough that I could hear her without her raising her voice. She said, "I would like to talk, when you're ready." I looked at her for a moment. "Okay," I said, "when I'm ready." She nodded. That was all. I drove home through the dark Virginia roads with the folder on the seat beside me and the window down and the cold March air coming through, and I let myself feel, for the first time in a very long time, something that I had not let myself feel in my mother's presence for years. I felt like myself, the whole of myself, not just the version that had learned to make itself small enough to fit inside the space she left available. I want to tell you one more thing before we get to what happened next, because I think it matters, and because this channel exists to tell the full truth of these stories, not just the satisfying parts. The Admiral's visit was not something I arranged to humiliate my mother. I want to be clear about that. The timing was what it was because the paperwork had been finalized when it was finalized, and I had asked him, when he called to tell me personally, which is not the standard protocol, but which he did anyway, whether it would be possible for him to deliver the orders in person, because I had a family situation, and I thought it might help to have someone present who could speak to the nature of my work in terms that I could not use myself. He agreed without requiring any further explanation, which told me something about what 16 years of a certain kind of work produces in terms of the people who know about it. But I did not plan the confrontation. I did not plan my mother's speech to her friends. I did not engineer the specific sequence of events that led to her standing in the center of her own living room, speechless, in front of 200 people, while a four-star admiral delivered a document to her daughter. Life arranged that. The choices she made over 34 years arranged that. I only made one call. I'm telling you this because I think there is a difference between justice and revenge, and I have spent enough time in proximity to both to know that the distinction matters. What happened at that party was not revenge. Revenge is a plan designed to cause suffering. What happened at that party was closer to a truth arriving late, with proper credentials, in dress whites. The weeks after the party were strange in a way that I had not anticipated. I had expected, I think, a kind of resolution, a before and after with a clear line between them. What I got instead was something more complicated and less cinematic, which is to say, it was more like actual life. My mother did call, approximately 10 days later. She called on a Wednesday evening, which was when she always called when she wanted to have a serious conversation, because she believed weekday evenings put people in a calmer state of mind. I answered on the fourth ring. She did not open with Renee, she opened with silence, just a few seconds of it, and then she said, "I've been thinking." I said that was good. Another silence. About the things I said. About what you do. I waited. I know I don't fully understand what it is. You can't tell me, I know that. She paused. But I want to understand, as much as you're able to tell me. I held the phone and looked at the water through my window, and I thought about 16 years, and I thought about that room and the silence in it, and my sister's hug and Gerald's handshake, and I thought about my father in the garage all those years, quiet in the way that people get quiet when they have no more fight left in them. And I said, "Okay, Mom, let me tell you what I can." We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation we had ever had. I told her things that were releasable and some things that were in gray areas, and a few things that I told her in very general terms without specifics that could be linked to operations or locations. She listened in a way she had not listened to me before, without filling the spaces, without redirecting to herself or to Renee. When I got to a part I could not describe, she said, "Okay, I understand," and she meant it. Near the end, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't ask." Her voice was different when she said it. Not younger, not softer exactly, but different in a way that suggested something underneath it had shifted. "I should have asked," she said. I said, "Yes, you should have." And she said, "I know." I don't know what comes next for my mother and me. I am not going to tell you that everything is healed or fixed or resolved because it isn't. 34 years of a certain dynamic does not reverse itself in an hour and 40 minutes on a Wednesday phone call. But something is different. Something that has been locked has been opened. Not completely, not without rust on the hinges, but opened. I will take that. I went to Renee's wedding. I wore my uniform because Renee asked me to, specifically, in a handwritten note that she left on my pillow when I stayed at her apartment the night before. The ceremony was at the converted estate my mother had described, and it was genuinely beautiful, and Renee cried when she walked down the aisle in the way that people cry when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. Marcus looked at her like she was the only thing in the room. My father sat next to me in the front row, and at one point he reached over and patted my hand, once, without looking at me, and I understood every word of it. My mother was at the reception. She found me during the cocktail hour and stood beside me looking out at the garden, and after a moment she said, "You look good in the uniform, Claire." I said, "Thank you, Mom." She said, "You always did." I looked at her. I looked at this woman who had held the narrative of my life for 3 decades and who was now, slowly, imperfectly, revising it. "I know," I said, and for the first time, I think I actually believed it. I want to say something directly to you, to everyone watching this right now, because if you're still here at this point in the story, you have been with it for a while, and you deserve a direct word. Some of you are carrying something similar, not necessarily a military career kept quiet, not necessarily $200,000 and a public confrontation, but something, a version of yourself that someone important to you decided on before you had chance to present yourself. A story about who you are that someone else told first, and told loudly, and told in front of the right people at the right moments, so that by the time you grew into the full shape of yourself, the story was already established, and the audience had already accepted it. I want to tell you something about that. The story is not permanent. The audience can revise its understanding. It may require an admiral in dress whites, or it may require something quieter, but the truth has a way of arriving eventually, not always in the form we would choose, not always at the time we would choose, but it arrives. The folder is framed now on the wall of my apartment, in the same room where I took the call from my mother about $200,000. I look at it sometimes, not because I need to be reminded of what is inside it, but because I need to remember what I believed about myself before I had it. I need to remember that the girl my mother saw was real to her, and that the woman I actually was existed at exactly the same time, in exactly the same body, walking through exactly the same rooms. Both things were true. Only one of them was the truth. Admiral Carver sent me a note after the party. Handwritten, which was characteristic of him, it said 3 sentences. I will not quote it directly, but in essence it said, he had spent his career learning to recognize a certain kind of person, the kind who does the work regardless of who is watching, who does not require the acknowledgement to keep going. He had rarely been certain about this judgment, he wrote. He was certain about mine. I keep the note in the folder with the promotion papers. One last thing, and then I will let you go. After the wedding, in the parking lot as we were leaving, an older couple stopped me. They had been at the reception, distant relatives of Marcus's, I think, or perhaps just family friends. I did not know them. The woman took my hand in both of hers, and she said, "Whoever you are, whatever you did, thank you. My nephew didn't come home." She did not elaborate, and I did not ask her to. I just held her hands for a moment, and I said what you say in those moments, which is never enough and is also the only thing. I said, "I'm sorry for your loss." She nodded. Her husband nodded. They walked to their car. I stood in the parking lot for a while after they left. The night was warm and clear, the kind of night that Virginia does in early summer, when the humidity has not yet settled in and everything smells like it is just beginning. I thought about the folder on my wall, and the phone call I had made, and the 11 months before that, and the 16 years before that. I thought about my father's hand on mine in the front row, and my sister's note on the pillow, and my mother's voice saying, "You always did." I thought about the woman's hands and her nephew who did not come home. And then I got in my car and I drove home, and the road was dark and straight, and I knew exactly where I was going. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment to actually think about it. Is there someone in your life who has never been seen fully? Someone who has been carrying something that nobody around them has bothered to ask about? If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, please share it with them. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to know you best? And what did it take for the truth to come out? I read every comment. I will see you in the next story. This is The Quiet Colonel. Good night.